This is NatSec Matters.
I'm your host, Jeremy Bash with Beacon Global Strategies. In November 2021, China stunned the international community with a hypersonic missile test that circled the globe and struck its target with remarkable precision. This incident, described at the time by the Joint Chiefs of Staff as a modern Sputnik moment, raised urgent questions about U.S. air defenses and the potential for a surprise nuclear strike against the U.S. homeland. And over the past 18 months, amid Israel's war with Iran and its proxies, we have seen Iranian ballistic, cruise, and drone attacks against Israel. And we've seen increasing threats against our own forces and bases, including a recent 14-missile ballistic attack by Iran against Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, where U.S. troops are stationed. The war in Ukraine has also highlighted the capability of drones to serve as an asymmetric standoff weapons threat, holding at risk adversary infrastructure and military and civilian targets. The drone threat has garnered significant attention in the United States as well, as we've seen concerning drone activity near U.S. military bases in New Jersey and Virginia. Against this backdrop, we now turn our attention to the Trump administration's Golden Dome initiative and its potential implications for national security. I'm joined today for this important discussion by Vice Admiral James Syring, the former director of the Missile Defense Agency. Through his decades of service in the United States Navy and as director of the Missile Defense Agency, Admiral Syring oversaw the agency's mission to defend the United States and deployed forces against ballistic missile attacks. Stay with us as we speak with Admiral James Syring about Golden Dome protecting the U.S. homeland. Admiral Syring, it's great to be with you today.
Great to be with you as well, Jeremy, and your listeners.
Well, we want to start here with just kind of an overview of what are the threats that the United States faces today. What are some of the systems that we currently have in place to deal with the missile and air defense threats? And what is driving the Trump administration to invest and field something that they are calling Golden Dome?
Sure, Jeremy. I think it'd be worthwhile to talk about the current systems that we have today and what threats they're designed against. And I'll just give a little bit of background to start, and then I'll talk specifically about the threats and what we can and can't do today. And then we can pivot to Golden Dome and everything that we know about what's been out there since the EO was signed back in January. Everybody knows that Ronald Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative back in 1983. Long story short, that office morphed into the Ballistic Missile Defense Office, which then morphed into the current Missile Defense Agency, of which I was the 9th director of. We really have come full circle, if you think about it, in terms of that program under Reagan really envisioned space-based interceptors in space that could intercept a wide array of intercontinental ballistic missiles from China or the Soviet Union at the time. And our system and our capability has morphed as the political spectrum has changed with the end of the Cold War, and really MDA was shaped, around the new threat. If you think about what we have, we actually talk about the missile defense systems in really two distinct areas right now: what we have for homeland defense, and then what we have for regional defenses. And it's really been a bipartisan effort over several administrations in terms of what their focus has been. And in the end, we built a fairly robust defense against threats like North Korea and Iran. And I'll talk a little bit about where that threat has gone even beyond those countries and what capability they now possess that they didn't when we first formed it. But if you remember, we fielded the ground-based missile defense system very rapidly in the 2002 to 2005 timeframe, and these brought the ground-based interceptors to Alaska, Fort Greely, Alaska, and to Vandenberg Air Force Base down in LA. this was really our first capability to get out and to show some capability against an ICBM threat. Now, it was limited and still is limited in terms of what that current system can protect against. It was never meant against a mass raid from China, the Soviet Union, or Russia today. It was meant as a limited defense to protect the homeland against a threat such as China or North Korea. Today, we have 44 interceptors in the ground, and that is our homeland defense system. But it goes way beyond just having interceptors in the ground that can take out an ICBM. You have to have sensing, and you have to have command and control of that capability as well. Many people don't know, but we have radars, long-range radars in Fylingdales, the UK, Thule, Greenland, and Alaska. And some of your listeners may have heard about the test that Missile Defense Agency did of the long-range discrimination radar in Alaska that really not only provides detection but allows us to discriminate, the threat as it cascades through stages of separation. That goes worldwide, and we do have protection from both the East and the West against threats to the U.S. We also have X-band radars that help with closing the fire control loop with TPY-2 radars in both Japan and Turkey. So if you think about it, it's really a global system that protects us against the ICBM threat today. And then worldwide, it's connected through the C2BMC system, which is the command and control system for missile defense that connects not just the capabilities, but the warfighter and the command and control of the defensive systems that we have. So that is what we call the Homeland Defense System. Mm-hmm. And you have to remember that this is, although it's very long range in terms of thousands of miles, the decision space for the warfighters is in minutes in terms of, detecting the threat from an overhead satellite sensor to passing that threat over to the TPY-2 radars for eventual detection by the long-range surveillance radars and discrimination that will cue our systems for intercept. And you're talking 15 to 20 minutes probably on a very plausible threat scenario. And the time and the decision space is very limited. And today we have warfighters up in Alaska that are defending, the nation, and they call themselves 300 protecting 300 million. Mm-hmm. I'll pause just there.
Let me ask you a couple of questions about that, because that is a good overview of the Homeland Defense System that exists today. A couple of questions. One is, when we talk about the intercontinental ballistic missile threat, so I presume we're talking about a threat that would be possessed primarily today by Russia, China, or North Korea, and that each of those countries have nuclear weapons or certainly the ability to make a nuclear weapon on an ICBM. So those 300 who are defending the 300 million up in Alaska, they are defending principally against a nuclear weapon being fired at the United States homeland. Is that right?
That's correct. A long-range intercontinental ballistic missile, potentially with nuclear capability.
Got it. And so, if there were a situation in which, say, North Korea launched something into space and it was maybe a little bit difficult to determine whether it was a rocket into space or an ICBM headed for the continental United States, the decision maker, presumably the president, in conjunction with the Secretary of Defense and the relevant combatant commanders, would have only a couple of minutes to decide whether to try to strike that missile en route with another missile that we would fire. And you said we have 44 of them based in California and Alaska. Is that basically right?
That's correct. They train on this scenario every day, several times a day, and they're able to determine very quickly whether that rocket launch or missile launch threatens the continental United States.
So I remember a former Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter, who I worked with when he was Deputy Secretary and I was serving as Chief of Staff for Secretary Panetta, used to say that missile defense is fundamentally about math. And if the adversary can field more than you've got to fire at them, then you're going to be in a challenge. And if we have 44 interceptors and Russia or China decided to fire, say, 200 ICBMs at the United States, would we be just, praying that most of those miss? I mean, tell me why the system was designed as it was.
Sure. It was never designed to counter the numbers that China or the Soviet Union or Russia now have. That was never the premise of the foundation for the ground-based missile defense. It was designed against rogue nations like North Korea and Iran, and a potential, accidental launch of an ICBM from either China or Russia that we could shoot down and avoid, a mass escalation. So it was really designed against the more limited ICBM threats, and therefore we only have 44 interceptors. But what it allows is protection of the country against those types of threats, which would allow offensive action to go the other way, and it just buys time for the decision makers in terms of what they have available to them. It was never designed against the arsenals that China and Russia possess then and possess today.
And some listeners here in the middle part of the country or the East Coast might be thinking, well, you got California and Alaska as the base for the interceptors, but is the whole country covered? I mean, I know it's kind of a elemental question, but would these missiles theoretically be coming over the North Pole or the Arctic and could range the entire United States? And could our interceptors cover the entire United States?
Yes, the answer is yes. And I just chuckle a little bit because I used to get that question all the time when I would be on a plane and somebody asked what I did. And I said I was in charge of missile defense. And almost to every person that I ever asked that sat by me always asked whether they were protected. And the answer is unequivocally yes. And you're exactly right that the threats do come over the North Pole in some cases, and in some cases, lower trajectories than that. But that's why we have interceptors, where they are in Alaska, because it can intercept both ballistic missile launched from Iran and from North Korea. And the intercept would be, well to the north. But it doesn't make, unless you think about it, intuitive sense. But that's why they're positioned the way they are.
Now, let's quickly talk about some of the regional defenses that you referenced. And maybe here you can help our listeners understand some terms that they might be hearing in the news, like Patriot and THAAD and things like that.
Sure. There's really, several different regional defense systems that have been fielded. Patriot is probably the oldest in terms of legacy, in terms of its air defense capability, which has been improved greatly over the years from just a endo-atmospheric, within the atmosphere intercept capability to, an exo-atmospheric capability in some cases. Much shorter range than where THAAD can potentially intercept. THAAD, the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, we have 6 batteries today. Going to 7 or 8 is what I think the budget documents say. Mm-hmm. But it provides us the capability of expanding the cone of protection around a certain geographic area. So think Patriot more near term and close in, and you hear Patriot talked about over in the Middle East today in terms of protecting, our base in Qatar, for example, and in Israel as well today. Think of THAAD as a further out protection system, same concept of intercepting ballistic missile threats, but in most cases intercepting them outside the atmosphere, which makes it much more feasible to not have debris, continue to fly to impact areas. So it's best for missile defense systems, if they can, for these long-range threats to intercept in the exo-atmosphere. And that's what THAAD does. It can also intercept, in the atmosphere as well. So it's got multi-tier capability. So think of Patriot and THAAD together protecting a designated geographic area, and you see in the Middle East what they're doing. And then the third major system is the Aegis ballistic missile defense system on our ships today, both cruisers and destroyers. And that provides a further umbrella of protection against defended areas. And you see our ships today on patrol in the Med, in the Red Sea, that provides protection of an additional layer of protection for Israel in terms of what they've been up against. But think of those three systems as the mainstays of our regional defense systems. And one thing I'll add is you may have heard of the European phased adaptive approach that was fielded back under President Obama in terms of how he pivoted that to basically three phases. That involved building missile defense sites in Romania and Poland, which protected our deployed forces in Europe and Western Europe against a threat from Iran. So we've really built this out both from a homeland standpoint and a regional standpoint with those three major systems.
And some of these systems reference Patriot, THAAD, and some of our sea-based systems. I mean, they are U.S. systems, but in some cases, some of them can also be either positioned in other countries or given to other countries. And recently, President Trump announced the resumption of providing Patriot batteries to Ukraine. And of course, we've also had technical exchanges and supported other countries as they've developed their own indigenous missile defense systems, like Israel's Iron Dome system, for which the United States has helped provide interceptors. And Israel has also developed systems like Arrow and David's Sling. So is kind of the concept that the U.S., in a leadership role, but in conjunction with key allies and partners, would develop a series of these regional systems that could help defend against the array of threats that many of our key partners and we are facing, to include not just that nuclear-tipped ICBM headed to us over the North Pole, but in fact, things like drones and cruise missiles and shorter and medium-range rocket artillery and mortar pieces and other ballistic missiles. Is that sort of the basic picture?
It is. That's a lot to unpack. If you just allow me just a minute
Please.
or two to talk about how it all fits together. So yes, we have foreign military sales of both Patriot and THAAD systems to the key allied countries. And that's been a key part of defenses that we've helped provide around the world. They obviously pay for those systems, but we in the U.S. have engineered those systems. I wouldn't say 100% alone, but we've carried the vast majority of the workload in terms of the engineering that was required and the testing that's required to develop those systems. And they've been very effective in different regions around the world. The whole thing with Israel and Iron Dome and David's Sling and Arrow is a really, really good point to talk about, because it'll eventually pivot us into Golden Dome. Mm-hmm. Iron Dome was really designed for the very, very short range rocket and artilleries that they faced from, threat countries in that region. It was not designed against, the medium or long range ballistic missile threat. So just think rockets and short range artillery. Iron Dome has been very, very effective in that. It was developed in the mid 2000s or so in terms of, Israel starting to think about how they can, defeat, incursions and launches from Lebanon at the time in a much more effective way. So it was a rapid pace of engineering that the U.S. has been partnered with them for many, many years now on not just the funding of that system, but the co-engineering and co-testing of both, of all three, of Iron Dome, David's Sling, and Arrow. And the Missile Defense Agency has a very close partnership with Israel today on co-engineering and test and fielding of those systems. So I like to say, Jeremy, that what we have done together between the U.S. and Israel in terms of the missile defense systems in that region as the conflict has happened and has escalated both locally and then to Iran, it literally has saved thousands and maybe hundreds of thousands of lives in terms of the intercepts that those systems have undertaken.
I think that's an important observation, and it's also something that probably isn't going to go away anytime soon, considering that Iran continues to maintain significant ballistic missile capabilities, and we've also got other threat actors in the region, like the Houthis, who have been firing drones and other missiles not just at Israel, but in fact at our forces. So the regional missile defense picture is going to continue to have to be the recipient of resources and focus and attention, and also training. And if maybe you could just, before we talk about Golden Dome, talk a little bit about the training required for people who operate these systems. This isn't just press a button and it automatically detects all the threats and shoots down these things. This requires some real operator skill. Isn't that right?
It does. And the air defenders that are serving our nation today and around the world are the best in the business. The system is not completely automated. It does require the operator to make decisions and to prioritize. And our operators do that every day. And certainly the Israeli operators are doing it, every minute at the peak of the conflict. But they are highly trained in many cases. For the U.S. systems, it is done here in the U.S. And we train not just the U.S. soldiers, but the foreign nation soldiers as well to operate their systems. And it's been a very, very close partnership with the warfighter and the prime contractors to provide that training. But you just think about the Patriot system that was left to protect Qatar when the retaliation happened of the 14 missiles for the bunker buster bombs that we used against the nuclear facilities. You had just single-digit operators and warfighters there defending that base with 14 missiles coming in, and they defeated all of them. I think it's just a testimony to not just the systems, but their heroic and courageous behavior. I was so proud of what they did when I heard the details.
I was too, and I didn't even know all the details, but as a citizen, I understood their skill and professionalism. Let me just do one more shout out to another key partnership that the missile defense teams of the United States have, and that's with the intelligence community, because obviously to get early indications and warning and early heads up that a launch is about to occur, or that a rogue nation or a terrorist organization is going to launch something, can often obviously operationally be determined about how much time we have to prepare. And that oftentimes comes from intelligence, including obviously human intelligence, signals intelligence, other technical intelligence, indications and warning. You made a reference earlier to some of our overhead systems. Maybe you could just talk a minute about your partnership with the intelligence community, both the
Sure.
U.S. intelligence community and our key allies and partners.
Sure. I can tell you when I was the director, we relied on them every day in terms of, if you remember, back when I was director in the 2012 to 2017 timeframe, North Korea was really, rearing its head and escalating in terms of threat. And the intelligence community helped me, and then General Jacoby, who was a NORTHCOM commander at the time, and we would get on calls every day and compare, okay, what are we hearing? Where are they moving? What are they doing? And that was all from the intelligence that we gathered, that was given to us, and frankly filtered it and sorted in a way that could be actionable. But without them, we couldn't prepare our warfighters, and we couldn't be ready to respond in the time that we did. I can tell you today that the without going into too much detail, that the cooperation amongst the defense agencies is present and coordinated. And I got to tell you, I was so proud with how we carried out the attack against Iran, and how that was all coordinated and frankly kept confidential and not leaked, and done in a way that incorporated the real-time intelligence. And without it, it's just not about kinetic capability. You have to have the intelligence behind it to know what to expect so you can plan.
Couldn't agree more. We're going to take a quick break, and we will be right back with more of our discussion with Vice Admiral James Syring.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
So now let's turn a little bit to Golden Dome. And we'll just note that in the news, if you've been following the news over the last couple of years, you've heard about some very high-end threats like hypersonic glide vehicles from China. And maybe we could talk about what some of those systems are. And then also, the quote-unquote low-tech threat from drones that we've seen employed in Ukraine. We've seen them employed against Israel. And I think there's a real concern here in the Homeland about some of our soft targets, whether it's a stadium or a high-rise building or a military base that have been dealing and navigating the threat from drones. So, if you're in charge today of the air defense space for the United States, you've got your hands full, and maybe you can talk a little bit about the threat landscape.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a very important point, Jeremy, that the threat in just the last few years has shifted significantly. We've all known about the long-range ICBM threat, obviously, that North Korea and Iran possess in terms of demonstration of staging of a three-stage rocket, into orbit and could deliver a payload today to the U.S. But what's happened in terms of the technology around hypersonics is worth a minute to discuss. Mm-hmm. And hypersonics has been around for a long time. It's always been the holy grail to be able to launch, a missile that can, briefly go into orbit, but come back down and cruise at hypersonic speeds in the atmosphere. And if it's able to cruise low enough, it can avoid detection by our systems, which, could be viewed as the Achilles heel of the current system that we have. I think that is a big reason why the president has pivoted to a Golden Dome approach, is around the hypersonic threat, which is basically, has the same characteristics as a cruise missile threat that could be launched from a platform. But the hypersonic threat requires even more sophistication because it requires not just detection at launch, but continuous tracking of that threat over thousands of miles for a potential intercept. And what it will do is it will fly under the operational capability of the Homeland defense system. And until we build out regional defense systems in the U.S., it could be a vulnerability for us against that type of threat. Now, I think that your listeners have probably heard of the testing that has gone on with China and Russia of the hypersonic capability. And in some cases, they've flown that threat for very, very long ranges. And that's concerning to many. And, not being on the inside, I'm sure, was the premise for some of the decision-making on Golden Dome. The capability, though, is, I wouldn't say infant. I would say being in a development, maybe even advanced development stage for full production. To be able to fly a threat at those types of altitudes over very long ranges produces a significant amount of heat. And if you were to have a significant warhead package on a threat like that, I think the problem quickly becomes, how do you insulate, a package against the types of heat profiles that will be existent in a hypersonic cruise missile. I think they will figure this out. We are rapidly figuring this out on the U.S. side, but it's not without technological challenges. The other thing, there's two other points. The cruise missile threat has always been there, and it can be launched from virtually, not just any ship platform, but merchant ship platform. Mm-hmm. It doesn't even have to be a warship for our enemy to fire a cruise missile at the United States. Another reason for pivoting to a Golden Dome type of threat scenario. And then the third part of it is drones, which I think may pose lesser of a threat than the other two. But again, swarms of drones could potentially be launched from ships off the coast. Mm-hmm. And we're going to need, as the EO says, a defense against all of the above. And I think that you'll see the budget priorities come through, that anti-drone defense is a key part that's been pulled through the budget. But I think we have to think about those three threats: hypersonic, cruise missiles, and drones together.
So let's just unpack a little bit about that. A cruise missile would be a missile that is powered in flight and as you said, could fly underneath our national missile defense systems, which are, as we talked about earlier, really geared towards that ballistic missile. A ballistic missile would kind of have a very high arc, and it would be kind of fired up into the atmosphere, into space, and then it would ballistically, meaning, just using the laws of physics and gravity, kind of drive into its target. A cruise missile, could maneuver, could be guided potentially, and as you said, could be fired from, let's just say, a Russian submarine off the coast of Massachusetts or Georgia, or it could be, off of another warship, or it could be fired at Hawaii. I mean, is the idea that a cruise missile is maneuverable and could be much more effective close in, and it kind of would give us much less warning time?
You've got it exactly right.
Okay.
The ICBM threat is much more predictable, literally, in terms of we know once it's launched where it's going to maneuver, where it's going to go. I would caveat that with a few exceptions without going into details, but mostly that's the case. And then cruise missiles and hypersonics have demonstrated their ability to maneuver, which further complicates our challenge. And I'll just keep it, obviously on class, but our Tomahawk, cruise missiles today maneuver, and that's well known. And our threat nations possess the same technology.
And when you were speaking about the heat signature, heat profile required for the flying of a hypersonic cruise missile or hypersonic glide vehicle, I should say, were you saying that it could be hard for them to fly because it would kind of burn up, or that'd be just easier for us to detect, or both?
No. It was more about protection of the warhead package.
Got it.
And being able to, put a significant warhead on something that has to be shielded from heat and needs to be light at the same time.
Got it. So it's an engineering challenge to put a massively heavy warhead on a glide vehicle, and then if it's traveling hypersonically, the heat could basically blow up the warhead. The warhead would need to be shielded, and I can tell you that the research and development that we're doing in the U.S. is rapidly closing that problem space. And so, in terms of building out such a system in the United States, tell us how you think the Department of Defense is currently thinking about this, because this is an enormous challenge. There's so many layers, so many altitudes, so many speeds to cover, and we've got a lot of land to cover. And it's not just the continental United States. We also have Alaska, we have Hawaii. And so how are we thinking about this? How are we beginning to design this?
The answer is that really nobody knows at this point, Jeremy, and that's not a great answer because there's just been so little that's come out in terms of the direction other than the top level EOs and, a few of the press conferences that have happened. But if you just think about what is feasible in the solution space within 3 years and what we need to protect against hypersonic cruise and drones, the continental United States, it really drives you to the regional systems we discussed before in terms of regional systems protecting geographic areas. And that to me could prove to be an effective defense against the hypersonic and cruise missiles. And you would think about protecting, the geographic areas that would be of interest, right? The, New York Cities, the Washingtons, the Bostons, the major, the LAs, the major cities and populations. I think it would be unaffordable and maybe, not prudent to say that we're going to protect everybody from every cruise missile. It's just, cost prohibitive if you think about that. I think the priorities will be set in terms of what we want to defend, what we need to defend, and the legacy systems we have today can do that. if you think about deployment of Patriot, that maybe even Aegis Ashore sites, which I spoke about earlier, that were built in Romania and Poland, that could defend, a wide area of coverage. If you think about what Romania and Poland cover today, it's a fairly significant part of Europe that they cover. And I would think that as they compete in my terms, the old, analysis of alternatives, AOA, that the Aegis Ashore systems will be highly considered, along with, shorter range, Patriot and THAAD missiles. The other thing I would add, two other things would be, do we need longer range radars on the east and west coast to help with, terrestrial radars to help with detection and handover to the regional systems? That would be an area that needs to be evaluated. And then the third, maybe even more important area is what do we do with the continuous detection and tracking capability that needs to hand over the threat from detection to the systems for interception. And that's where the LEO constellation, low Earth orbit constellation ideas that have been around for decades, frankly. We used to have a system at MDA called the Persistent Tracking Surveillance System that was envisioned to be a constellation of LEO satellites. And had we stuck with it, we'd be ahead right now. And I know the Space Force is really trying to, rapidly develop and field that. And I think that LEO constellation is critical for us to field a hypersonic cruise missile defense capability.
So you're really talking, it sounds like, about a system of systems. A Golden Dome isn't going to be just one system that's built from scratch from the ground up. It's going to be most likely in the timelines outlined in the EO, an integration, maybe a tailoring, but certainly an integration of a number of existing systems. And when I think about defending a landmass, let's say the size of Israel, which is call it the size of New Jersey, it really requires a variety of systems, including, as we talked about, Patriot, some THAAD, some Aegis, both ship-based and maybe Aegis Ashore, and they've got their own short range, as you referenced, Iron Dome systems for rocket artillery and mortars and drone defense. And so it sounds like what we're probably looking at is across the major populated areas of the United States, a system of systems in each place that would be kind of tailored for the geography of each place. Is that right?
Again, I'm not on the inside, Jeremy, but I would think that as I'm familiar with many of the systems, that is what will be thoroughly studied. And it has to be done very, very quickly. I'm sure General Gutlein, who I've not spoken to, has a team looking at this as we speak. And I just think that if they want to field something within 3 years, that it's going to have to leverage a lot of the legacy systems. Plus, I'm not to say that there won't be new technology that could be fielded very rapidly. And some of the new technology companies have some great ideas of what could be done, with anti-drone technology, for example. And then many of them, not many, but several of them are also thinking through the space-based interceptor capability, which we haven't talked about, in terms of building out a more robust homeland defense system against ICBMs. And we've, again, come full circle now in 40 years where we're now talking, SBI again and brilliant pebbles. And, it's just funny how that's come around. But I think the technology has moved well beyond where it was 40 years ago. I've been asked if it's technologically feasible. I said yes, because it doesn't necessarily have to be interceptors. It could be, kinetic kill vehicles on small satellites, for example, if you put enough up there. So it's time is now to really push to see what can be done and what's feasible. I think the commercial launch capability that is available today that wasn't available 40 years ago, and in terms of us being able to ride share, large numbers of these types of satellites or kill vehicles or interceptors is going to be a key enabler for the United States to be able to field something very quickly and rapidly.
So what you're talking about is really the advances we've had in our commercial launch business, primarily powered by SpaceX, and now there are some other players as well. But as they put up satellites into orbit, almost weekly, there are opportunities to put not just some of the sensing satellites. You referenced low Earth orbit, maybe mesh networks of satellites orbiting the globe to detect potential launches or attacks against the United States, but also maybe some weapons, some kinetic vehicles that could be coming off of a satellite in low Earth orbit. That would be sort of the finished solution, if you will, against a threat. Did I get that right?
Yeah, exactly right. I think the time is now, given how technology has moved, for us to really press to see the feasibility, and then if it's feasible, what can we rapidly field? And 40 years ago, it would have taken us forever to schedule a launch and do a launch and all of that. But the technology on launch and the business, strategies around launch has moved, obviously. Not just SpaceX, but Rocket Lab as well. And a lot of the new commercial companies are bringing excellent thinking and excellent technology to bear on that part of the problem with space-based interceptors.
And I assume also AI will play a major role in helping to do target discrimination and helping those operators make decisions quickly. But we'll probably still have humans in the loop, but maybe enabled by AI as these newer systems are built out. Particularly when so many of these threats against us can look like maybe civilian aircraft. You think about a large drone may have some of the same characteristics as a small civilian aircraft. And you think about even an ICBM could have some of the same characteristics as a satellite. And so I presume we're going to be relying on AI more and more.
I think that you're exactly right, yes. And I think that with where compute has gone over even the last 10 years, we're in a much better position now to use that as an enabler for not just quicker decision making, but more accurate decision making to buy more battle space for the operator. I think it's a tremendous opportunity to integrate some of that capability into such as the C2BMC system today, and I'm sure MDA is thinking through that. But it's much more than just accessing a database for a threat characteristic that it might look like this. I think we have enough compute capability to surface that information much more real time and much more in depth and detail.
So it sounds like from the perspective of private industry looking to find ways to partner with the team building Golden Dome, there are a myriad number of opportunities to include some of the radar systems that you referenced might be required, some of the space-based systems that might be required, some of the AI software and compute systems that might be required, some of the kill chain vehicles that might be required. And as you said, we might also be expanding some of the legacy systems like our National Missile Defense System that's designed against the ICBM threat. And as I think we talked about, a little bit during the first Trump administration, North Korea flight tested 2 ICBMs that could range the United States. And so that threat isn't going away anytime soon.
No, it's not. It's escalating. And my personal opinion is that Iran is just living to fight another day at this point. Mm-hmm. And if we were to let our guard down, that would be a significant mistake on our part to not think that they're going to continue. I think they've been set back by years with the attack, but we should not rest that they do not wish on building a nuclear weapon. I think it would be a mistake for the United States. I also think that North Korea has continued to escalate, but maybe a little bit under the radar given this administration. But their intent and capabilities continue to be, progressive in terms of advancing, their capabilities so they can continue to assert standing on the world stage.
As we close, I just want to maybe quickly touch on one or two of the criticisms we've heard about the Golden Dome approach. First, there's the traditional criticism of missile defense systems, which is that they are, quote unquote, destabilizing because they incentivize our adversaries to field other systems, and there's kind of a race, an arms race, if you will. Just love your quick take on that real quick, and then we'll talk about some of the cost and schedule issues.
I get the question a lot, and I would just point to what the missile defense systems did in Israel. And if you remember when there was the mass ICBM and mass attacks that I think happened on two different occasions, both drones and missiles, that the system was able to defend and protect the civilian population from catastrophic widespread damage. And to me, in that case, missile defense de-escalated a potential much larger global situation that allowed the policymakers to buy space, to allow a much more mitigated response, as opposed to a widespread, demolition of Iran or any of the countries that were involved in the conflict. I think it helped stabilize the situation and bought time for what is now the ceasefire. So the second thing I would say is that the economics of missile defense back on the U.S. soil is such that, what price would we put on, destruction of New York City or Washington, D.C.? And the economics on that are unfathomable. And to me, given our technological capability in the U.S. and, superior engineering, that, we can defend this nation against that type of threat. And it's not going to be cheap, but those that say that the calculus isn't there are just mistaken in terms of what this can do to, frankly, avoid, a World War III type of scenario, to allow people to really work through it on the policy side.
Those are very, very helpful insights. And then as far as the skeptics or the criticisms we've heard about how expensive this is going to be, you've just addressed that with respect to the economic impact of a successful attack, and that's what we're defending against. And finally, I would say, is this something the U.S. can do alone, or should we be looking to work with like-minded countries, allies, and partners out there to help us field such a system?
No, I think it needs to be. I think it needs to be all of the above in terms of people that have the capability and have helped us in the past. There's very, very good, missile and missile defense engineers in Japan. There's very good engineers that have helped, develop and integrate systems over in Europe, and no, defensive systems, no interceptors inside and out. I think that, given what they need to do, like I'll just specifically talk about NATO and Europe, that we should be looking to partner with them for the systems that I think they will be looking to build out and expand. I don't think on the space-based interceptor side, I think that's probably going to be U.S. only. But I think on these regional systems in terms of moving them for defensive capability against hypersonics or cruise missiles, that the NATO nations can and need to and will step up.
Admiral Syring, it's been a great honor to speak to you. Obviously, your knowledge and your expertise is incredibly valuable and insightful today as the United States contemplates building a Golden Dome system to protect our homeland. We thank you for your decades of service to our country and for your continued service as an advisor to those who are going to be supporting this effort. And we'll invite you back, Admiral, to come talk in more depth as this system is built out and you can help explain it to our listeners. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks again, Jeremy. Nice to meet you, and thanks for the call.
That was Vice Admiral James Syring. I'm Jeremy Bash of Beacon Global Strategies. If you enjoy listening to NatSec Matters, please leave us a rating and review. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're interested in becoming a sponsor, please email our team at bgs@bgsdc.com. We love sponsorships. You can also find this email in the show notes. Please join us next week for another episode of NatSec Matters.
NatSec Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. NatSec Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.